Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this launch of the updated Royal Town Planning Institute and Town and Country Planning Association guidance for local authorities on planning for climate change. I'm Fiona Howie and I'm the Chief Executive of the TCPA, and I'm delighted to be chairing our event today. And we are delighted to have so many people attending and registered to attend. It clearly shows this is very important and topical. I must firstly run through some housekeeping for the event. We will be recording the event and we will make that recording available afterwards. We will send it out to everyone that's registered and it will be available on our website. If you use social media, please use the hashtag which is on the slide, so planning for climate change. And as you'll see from the programme, we'll have a presentation from Hugh and Jessie. We'll have responses to the guide, and then there will be time for questions and discussions. So please do put any questions that you would like me to put to our speakers or the panel members into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I will endeavour to get through as many of those as possible after everybody has contributed. I must also thank the RTPI for partnering with us on this really important guidance. And I also want to thank Floodery, Land Use Consultants and Green Blue Urban for sponsoring the guide as well. Now, I don't want to say too much about the context because I'm conscious that everybody knows that we're in the run-up to COP. But of course, for us, this event and the guidance feel incredibly timely, but equally, the role of planning in relation to climate change is something that many of us, and I'm very conscious many in the audience as well, have been talking about for some time. This is actually the third version of this guidance, with versions 1 and 2 actually published quite close together back in 2018. But we're really particularly pleased that this new version covers the whole of the UK rather than just England, which, as again, we're really appreciative of the support of the RTPI in that area in particular. But since the previous versions were published, there have been, of course, been some key moments in terms of government commitments, and these mean that we're launching the guidance, this version of the guidance, in a really different policy and legislative landscape than the previous versions. In 2019, the UK became the first major economy in the world to pass laws to end its contribution to global warming by 2050. In December 2020, the Climate Change Committee published the 6th Carbon Budget. And earlier this year, the UK enshrined in law a new target of reducing emissions by 78% by 2035. But I think it's fair to say that despite the publication of 2 new strategies by the government today, it remains unclear whether this new target will be achieved. Audience members may well be aware of Alok Sharma's speech at UNESCO in Paris earlier this month. Of course, part of his role as president for COP26 has been urging countries to commit to net zero by the middle of the century and set ambitious plans to cut emissions by 2030. But as he also highlighted in his speech, the targets must translate into change across our economies and our societies. And he also talked about the Glasgow negotiated outcome needing to launch a decade of ever-increasing ambition. And he also said, while all countries must act, those with greatest responsibility must do more, which are, of course, welcome words. And we are looking to COP for international cooperation, leadership, and commitments on this issue. But I think what we want to highlight today is that we need action at every level. In the last hour, we finally have a net zero strategy for government, and I must highlight upfront that I'm afraid this won't be a detailed analysis of those documents that have come out in the last couple of hours. But it is worth noting that the new net zero strategy states that government recognises the importance of the planning system to common challenges like combating climate change, but they also mention supporting sustainable growth. And it restates the government's commitment to review the National Planning Policy Framework, which I know is England only, to make sure it contributes to climate change mitigation and adaptation as fully as possible. So while we look forward to that review, we must not sit back and wait for it. This guide highlights that local authorities, many of whom will have declared climate emergencies, can and must get on, take urgent action at the local level. So without further ado, I will hand over to Hugh Ellis and Jessie Fieth to give our first presentation and introduce the guide to you all.
Well, thanks very much, Fiona, and welcome everybody. My name's Hugh Ellis and I'm Policy Director at the TCPA, and between myself and Jessie in the next sort of 8 to 10 minutes, we're going to give a very brief summary of what the guide does. But just to follow on from what Fiona said, it's been a 30-year process of working on planning and climate change. And in that time, the politics has changed profoundly. It's even changed profoundly, I think, in the last 6 months. So I'm not going to do what might be expected, which is to make the moral and economic case for why we take action on climate change. But I will say that our best professional judgment and what underpins this document is that we have to redesign and remake almost every aspect of the built environment if we are to be fit for the challenge of net zero and fit for the challenge of the impacts we know are in the system. And that does mean that planning is at the heart of that. And if you take the definition of planning broader than the current planning systems defined, for example, in England, that means asking this question: how are we going to organise ourselves for the greatest challenge that humanity's ever faced? So that's enough to get you up, hopefully, on a Monday morning and into the job. But those impacts will be severe, and there are issues that planners are uniquely well placed to deal with, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's absolutely clear that we're going to have to relocate parts of our population. It's absolutely clear that there are some communities that are going to have to be moved simply because the vulnerabilities are too high. And it's also clear that from our cities, for example, in relation to cooling, that we have to redesign and green our cities in the most rapid and unprecedented way. So the challenge is certainly there. But I think that the planning system, and you would expect this coming from an event in which the RTPI and the TCPA are wedded together in common cause, you'd expect me to say that the role of planning in solving this crisis has been underestimated. The reason it's central is because it's capable of doing the powerful things that we need it to do. Thinking, for example, over the long term, thinking at its best strategically, it has to do that. And then thinking again about the power that planning has, not just to plan, to future plan for the sorts of shocks to the system, but to encourage and enable the kind of innovation in energy systems that we know that we're going to need. So its role in consenting and in strategizing is absolutely pivotal. It is the gateway test across the nations and regions of the UK about how we deliver on this. You can set as many CO2 target reductions as you like, or as many resilience tests as you like. The test ultimately is whether these things happen on the ground, and that is the power of planning. I think, as other speakers might allude to, our view is definitely that planning will have to do a great deal more, and we are moving into the kind of territory of needing some very powerful solutions, for example, for the East Coast of England. But the ability of planning to deal with mitigation to reduce our emissions through design and energy systems is certainly one key idea, and its ability to adapt to climate change through similarly designed processes like sustainable urban drainage and other design measures is there. But there's one other element which is critical to local planning, and that's people. The planning system is often criticised by being full of people with strong voices, but that's also, of course, its great strength. And when we declare climate emergencies, that's fine, but the planning process has got to be ready to help work with communities to offer practical solutions that will really drive change. And that's one of the great strengths of the system across the board. When it works well, it can work in collaboration and cooperation. And one of the key messages I think that comes out of this is that sometimes there's a culture where we're arguing amongst ourselves about what to do about climate change. I want to appeal with everything I've got today to say that as governments, as local authorities, as developers, as communities, as agencies, if we don't work together now, if we can't find common cause on this issue, then I'm not sure what we ever will. And it's so vital, I think. This has not to be an argument between ourselves, but a drive for national survival. And that's clearly the test in front of us. In relation quickly to the guide itself, Jessie will say some more about the detail in a second. Just two final themes, really. There's a very strong theme in this version of the guide, obviously, on the logic of the 6 carbon budget. So if you're taking one or two things away from this session, it's absolutely vital that local plan strategies and decisions reflect the logic of the 6 carbon budget and the direction of travel that sets and the contribution planning can make. So as I said, that's a contribution, isn't it? That's partly about enabling sustainable transport and energy systems and a multitude, a basket of other policies. which can take us to net zero. And it's vital that those are systematically assessed for their contribution towards the 6 carbon budget. So in the back of our minds, local plans across all nations and regions are founded on that target. That is the core central logic of what we need to be doing in local planning. And then on adaptation, I think the opportunity of local planning is to begin to plan for the time periods which the environment agencies across the nations and regions have set for us. So if you think your local plan is planning for 5 to 15 years, well, on climate change, it's planning for 100 years plus, and for some critical infrastructure, much longer than that. And if the Environment Agency's climate change flood risk allowances aren't stapled to the front of your desk in a local planning policy section, then they need to be. You need to be looking at the potential for sea level rise. And again, I'm thinking very much constructing sensible and reasonable worst case scenarios. That's really important because the data on climate change is complex and we need to communicate it in ways which can resonate with communities and give them opportunities for action. Final point, this isn't government guidance. And in England, we earnestly hope that the review of the National Planning Policy Framework will move us towards a much better policy response. And the reason we've published this guidance is because there is a gap, certainly in England and to some degree in other nations and regions. So it's important that what we're saying is a joint shared professional message. And our expectation is that the Planning Inspectorate, local authorities, developers will follow this guidance. We're advocating that at the moment, but we are absolutely certain that this is the direction of travel. For businesses, for local authorities, for government, this is the journey that we're now on. And so this guide is hopefully going to help us in that direction. I'm going to stop there, Fiona, and pass forward to Jessie.
And thank you everyone so much for joining today. I'm just going to talk really briefly about the content of the guide and how we've got to this point. So as Fiona mentioned in her introduction, we first published this version of the joint TCPA RTPI guidance back in 2018. And then of course the context has shifted drastically since then, and climate change is no longer a peripheral issue, but has definitely moved into the mainstream. And so with that in mind, as Hugh said, the focus and messages of this guidance have been significantly updated and strengthened. And the latest edition aims to help local authority action on climate change by outlining what can be achieved and delivered through the UK planning system, and also highlighting good practice and case studies. So the guide is an introductory level resource for anyone who is working with the planning system to deliver climate action. We have tried not to duplicate any work already done by others, but rather signpost to other resources and organisations that already work in this space. And on that note, I do have to say a huge thank you to our working group who helped us develop the content of the guide. We're really, really grateful to you all for giving up your time and expertise and supporting this process. So just quickly, I thought I would quickly run through the guidance. It is divided into 6 sections. The first is an overall introduction. The second lays out the legislative and policy position in each of the 4 nations. The third section talks about approaches to local plan development and preparation. And it starts with the evidence base, and then it goes through greenhouse gas emission reduction and also climate change adaptation measures. The 4th section talks about development management processes, and again covers both adaptation and mitigation. And then we have the conclusion, and section 6 is a list of further resources. The guide covers a lot of detail, but we hope that it has been written in a way that it is easy to sort of dip in and out of and find the information that you're looking for, rather than reading it from cover to cover necessarily. But we also appreciate that it is over 60 pages long and there is a lot to get through. So I thought I would just run through some of the core messages and recurring themes that this guidance promotes. So firstly, and most importantly, we advocate that climate change should be a core principle of every local plan. This means not just having a chapter focused on climate change, but also including it as an overall aim and taking it into consideration in nearly every policy area and planning decision that you make as a local authority. And as Hugh was talking about earlier, there are metrics detailed in the guide which will help you to do that. Secondly, you should always choose the policy option that will result in the biggest carbon reduction. Easy to say, I know, but the more successful successfully we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, the smaller the impacts of climate change will be. Which brings me on to how we must transform our approach to dealing with the impacts of climate change. And as the Environment Agency, who we'll hear from later, said last week, we will experience floods on the scale that happened in Germany this summer in this country. And the only way that we are going to protect our communities from huge loss and destruction is by making the places resilient to extreme weather events that will be caused by climate change. Next up is to seek to deliver well-designed measures that reduce carbon emissions and deal with the impacts of climate change, which can also, if they are well done, deliver multiple other benefits for communities as well. And then my final point is that the most vulnerable population groups will be hit the hardest by the impacts of climate change, and so planning policy and decisions must consider a climate justice lens. There is a growing gap between local planning authorities who are leading on this work and proactively addressing the climate crisis through planning, and those who are less well advanced. And we really hope that this guidance can help to close this gap. Can I have the next slide, please? As well as those organisations who have financially supported the guide and fed into its development, we are also really, really pleased that several other organisations have signed up to endorse the new guidance. And we would like to extend an open invitation to everyone here today to add their name, either individually or organisationally, to this list to demonstrate your support for the content and messages of this guidance. So to keep this simple, we will keep this opportunity open for 2 weeks until Tuesday, the 2nd of November. And if you would like to endorse the guide or have any questions about this process, please do email me, and my email is on the screen there. We will then do an update to the report and the webpage with the final list of supporters. We really, really hope that some of you will be able to do this. And yes, that's all I was going to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessie, and thank you, Hugh, as well. I can see that people are posting their questions in the Q&A function. Thank you very much. We will now have responses from our panel members, and then we will come to the Q&A for both our presenters and our panel members. So we've got a fantastic panel lineup, I think, today. And first of all, I'm going to introduce Dr. Wei Yang. Wei is president of the Royal Town Planning Institute for 2021, and she's the founder of Wei Yang and Partners, an award-winning master planning firm in London. Over to you, please, Wei.
Thank you, Fiona. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to join the launch of the RTPI TCPA joint publication, The Climate Crisis, a Guide for Local Authority on Planning for Climate Change. First of all, as the RTPI president and also a member of the TCPA, I would like to thank Hugh and Jessie and other colleagues from the TCPA and RTPI and everyone contributed to this important publication. Every day you are reminded of the serious and the direct impact climate change has on our communities. With the UK government and the local authorities making a range of climate commitments in recent years, planning professionals are at the forefront to help achieve these targets. We are concerned that the effects of climate change will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable individuals in the country, and we believe the planning system utilized properly can prevent this happening. Also, many of the actions necessary to tackle the climate crisis are also key in creating healthy, ecologically rich, prosperous, and beautiful places for us and for our future generations. The guidance set out a range of ways in which the planning system can take the lead in preparing for and tackling climate change. When I read the report, now several times since I received the first draft, I can still feel the passion and the sense of urgency behind the words. This decade is crucial to tackle the climate and the biodiversity emergency. The time to confront the climate crisis is now. There's a sentence in the report really touched me. Planning is a key part of our national survival system. It should embed the principle at all levels. Nothing should be planned without having successfully demonstrated it is fit for it to take its place in a net zero emissions future. So why planning and the planning profession are so important in our journey to achieve a net zero emissions future? That's because planners, we come from communities and we work for public interest. we are distinguished by our primary commitment to the benefit of the public and the long-term interests of our society. Our remit is what should be done now to make our world a better place for our future generations. Nowadays, climate change ranks highest as the most important issues facing the world amongst 18 to 25 years old globally. We must ensure that tackling climate crisis is heart of the vision for the future of our communities. Planning plays a vital role to secure that vision. The UK Climate Change Committee has recognized spatial planning as one of the biggest opportunities that local authorities have to deliver net zero. It is supported by many leading voices in the country and around the world. In 2020, the Council for Science and Technology wrote to the UK Prime Minister on achieving net zero for carbon emissions through a whole systems approach. The world's leading scientists also argued that treating climate, biodiversity, and human society as coupled systems is key to successful outcomes from policy interventions. Planning is people-centric and is about the future. It's a subject that relates to everyone's life. I believe the fundamental objective of the planning profession is to create a balanced system for people, nature, and society to coexist in harmony. The full remit of spatial planning covers land and marine areas. It deals with our relationship with natural and built environment. As an applied social, environmental, and behavioral science, it synthesizes a variety of prospects and approaches. It is the glue that binds built and natural environment expertise together to create a better future for public interest. How our living environment is planned has direct influence on people's daily activities, their health and well-being. People's choice for healthier and low-carbon lifestyles are limited by the built environment. Planning plays an essential role with its ability to integrate energy, transport, and land use planning, encourage sustainable travel, develop the best local solution to low-carbon energy, deliver well-located and energy-efficient buildings, guide investment in integrated blue and green infrastructure, and coordinate strategic resilience to the impacts of climate change. It is evident that the vast amount of research and studies are calling for one thing: utilizing place-based spatial planning in a long-term, strategic, multidisciplinary systems approach can be a transformative solution to coordinate the effects from different professionals to tackle the grand challenges of our times. It's also the most effective way to influence human activities and lifestyles. As stated in the 6th carbon budget, different ways of societal and behavioral change can contribute to as much as 59% in the balanced net zero pathway. To achieve the ambitious goals of reaching zero carbon, delivering natural capital net gain, and leveling up the country, the need for a collaborative approach where balanced decisions are reached in order to do the right thing has never been more important. Transformative change needs to start from how we work with each other, how we share our data and knowledge, and how we communicate with the public. The RTPI believes local authorities should have chief planning officers at the top table of decision-making. The chief planning officer could play a key coordinating role in delivering integrated strategies for climate actions, economy, infrastructure, and the environment as part of a place-based approach. Also, unlock the full potential of spatial planning, we need well-resourced and equipped planning. And also planners need to be upskilled. At the moment, local authorities in England, for example, are spending just £5.5 per resident annually on planning policy. So the RTPI is calling on the government to provide the English planning system with funding of £500 million over the 4 years in the comprehensive spending review. That is less than £2.5 per person annually. However, it can make significant contribution towards the climate and the leveling up agenda. Also, within this £500 million required budget, we have suggested a £67 million climate action budget. It can deliver the equivalent of one full-time planner to work exclusively on climate-proofing policy and development management in each local authority. Finally, once again, I want to urge local authorities ensure tackling climate change is the priority and utilizing spatial planning as a positive force to achieve our joint mission of creating a net zero emissions future. The RTPI and TCPA are here to support you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wei. That's really helpful. And again, thank you to our audience who are putting lots of questions in the Q&A box. And I know there are a couple in the chat as well, which I will try and keep an eye on as well. But if you are able to put them in the Q&A, that would help me keep them in one place. But over to our next panel member now. Without further ado, we are delighted to have with us today Baroness Brown, who is a crossbench member of the House of Lords. She was Vice Chair of the UK Climate Change Committee for 12 years from 2008 to 2021 and is currently Chair of the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee. That's a lot of C's. Thank you ever so much, Baroness Brown, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And let me start by saying I welcome this guidance very, very warmly indeed. Net zero seems to have captured everybody's imagination. And the biggest challenges, of course, for achieving net zero come with transport and buildings, and of course with the carbon footprint of construction and infrastructure projects. So it's absolutely clear how crucial planning is to achieving net zero. But what I really welcome in this guide is the very, very strong focus on adaptation, because keeping people safe and making sure they can live healthy and happy lives as the climate changes, making sure we are resilient to the floods, the heat waves, the drought, and the other impacts of our changing climate is also absolutely crucial. And we need to recognize that even if we are globally on this path that we all want to be on to net zero and to the Paris targets of close to 1.5 and no more than 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century, even if we are on that path, and we hope COP will help us to achieve that, the temperatures still go on rising until 2050, and the climate still goes on changing. Sea level goes on rising beyond 2050. So we may have had the 10 hottest years on record, but I will pretty much guarantee you every decade from now to 2050 will be the 10 hottest years on record, and we need to be ready for that. So in June this year, the Adaptation Committee presented our advice to government on preparing for climate change, our advice on the third climate change risk assessment. And we offered 10 principles for effective adaptation. So I tested the guide against our 10 principles, and I have to say it did very well. So our first principle is that you need a vision for a well-adapted UK or a well-adapted city or a well-adapted combined authority area or whatever scale you're working at. And the guide does have some quite visionary parts where it talks about 20-minute neighborhoods. It talks about the kinds of neighborhoods that will be well adapted to the climate. So well done. I think you help us with developing a vision. Our second principle was that adaptation must be integrated into all policies. And you clearly make a very strong case in the guide of how essential it is to really integrate adaptation into all elements of planning. And it was good to hear from Hugh that also features in the net zero strategy, which I haven't yet had a chance to look at. Our third principle was that we must adapt for 2 degrees, but we must also be planning with the risks of 4 degrees in mind. And clearly, as you mentioned, the guide touches on issues like the need for coastal relocation. So the guide clearly touches on those issues. We must avoid lock-in. I think the comments about needing to be thinking of planning for 50 to 100 years is the way we will avoid lock-in. And one of the things I noticed in the guide that I was particularly happy to see was the comment about safeguarding land for future flood risk infrastructure. I'm working with Julie Foley on the Thames Estuary 2100 plan, and that's absolutely crucial that the people who are responsible for the areas alongside the river are thinking about the conditions in the river, the sea level rise, the nature of the protective infrastructure we will need in 50 years and indeed in 100 years' time. So we must avoid lock-in. Prepare for unpredictable extremes, things like the German flooding, which, as the Environment Agency have told us, could happen here. Assess interdependencies. Recognise that a failure in one place will have knock-on impacts, particularly if it's to something like part of the electricity system, can have knock-on impacts right through society. Understanding threshold effects, for example, temperatures where behaviour suddenly clicks from one thing into another. Address inequalities. I was really impressed by the very strong focus on this throughout the guide and the absolute recognition that climate change impacts actually exacerbate inequality hugely. They really do hit the elderly, the poor, much harder than they do the healthy and the well-off, for example. So it was great to see that mentioned frequently as a consideration throughout this guide. And then, as we come to number 9, consider the opportunities. The opportunities of the changing climate will be nothing like as great as the disadvantages, but where there are opportunities, we should be thinking about them and making sure we make the most of them. And then finally, our 10th principle to government, not to local government, to central government, was to say that funding, resourcing and metrics and research are all critical, and we need more of all of those. But having looked at the guide in the context of our 10 principles, I felt it really got a kind of at least an A, if not in some areas like the addressing inequalities, an A+. So a really very helpful document, which I'm sure will be an enormous benefit to councils and the planning community. And I hope it gets really well thumbed, or whatever the electronic version of that is. So very well done. It's hugely welcome. And thank you very much. Just one tiny point. And it may be that it's that division between what's planning and what's building regulations. The only one tiny point was that I would have liked to see more about water efficiency. It does get a mention, but I'd have liked to see it mentioned in slightly more places. I sort of feel overheating and flooding are treated very well. Water efficiency is going to be, particularly for me in the Cambridgeshire area, where we have a lot of new housing likely to be built. Water efficiency is going to be truly important to us. But really well done, and thank you very much indeed for a very good and a very useful piece of work.
Thank you ever so much, Baroness Brown, and really lovely to hear that you feel that it aligns so strongly with the points that you were raising. So we will crash on, because I know we are getting lots of questions, so I don't want to delay with long introductions. But our third response is from Julie Foley. Julie is Director of Flood Risk Strategy and National Adaptation in the Environment Agency. In that role, she's responsible for leading the development of the Environment Agency's flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy, working with government, risk management authorities and other partners. So over to you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Fiona, and to talk about the some of the work we're doing on flood and coastal risk management, and importantly, in this context, our role as a statutory planning consultee. So if I go on a slide, please. So let me just set the context for our work on flood and coastal risk management. Hugh mentioned this really briefly at the start. We laid in Parliament and published last year an FCERM strategy, flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. And that set out our vision for a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change today, tomorrow, and looking out to 2100, quite rightly. The big shift that we made was recognising that we can't just be having a conversation about more and more better protection. So absolutely, flood and sea defences and hard engineering will play its part, and it will continue to play its part. But as our chair, Emma Howard-Boyd, has said on many occasions now, we can't expect to build our way out of managing future climate risks. And in the face of a changing climate, we need to start planning and adapting for the unavoidable impacts of climate change, of which flooding, but not just flooding, but water stress and other challenges is one of those. And that means embracing a much broader range of solutions. And again, in the context of today, it's about really good placemaking and the role that we should play in avoiding inappropriate development in high flood risk areas and building really sustainably and seeing the opportunities for that. Hugh referenced again at the start that this summer we put some of this into practice when we published our new climate change allowances, with the first national body in England to do that actually is to build in a wide range of climate allowances into the way in which we design and assess new flood and coastal schemes, but also in the advice that we give planners and developers on spatial planning to look for the opportunities of better planning and adapting. If I go on another slide, please. So I just want to spend a few moments talking about the role that we play in spatial planning. As many of you will be aware, and I know we've got a local authority, lots of local authority joining us today, so you'll know that we're one of the statutory consultees when it comes to planning applications. We see in the order of about 8,000 planning applications with a flood risk specific aspect every year. Quite a lot of those, we actually raise initial objections, probably about a third, would you believe, as not actually having an adequate flood risk assessment. So in some cases, there's some real basics that we can be improving here. To look on the bright side, 97% of planning applications that we respond to are decided in accordance with EA advice. And that's great, and it shows the great collaboration and positive working we have with many local authorities. But at the same time, as this slide shows you, we have far too many homes that are still being granted against our advice. And you want to get that number down to zero, isn't it, ultimately, if we're going to have sustainable growth into sustainable and safe growth into the future, particularly when you bear in mind that our own work suggests that we could have a doubling of homes in the floodplain over the next 50 years. And when you overlay some of the projections for housing growth, some of the things that we're seeing coming through with some of the planning reforms, there's a real wake-up call there, isn't there, about the strength of the need to continue to strengthen planning policy for all aspects of flood risk. I think I would particularly highlight that some of the aspects around surface water flooding could be strengthened particularly further. We've talked about coastal transition, the importance of factoring in coastal erosion and other challenges, but actually one of the growing areas of risk inland, which we need probably stronger planning mechanisms around, is definitely surface water. I go on one more slide. I wanted to pick up on nature-based solutions. And I think this gives an opportunity to bring in something that Julia was just talking about, actually, about having integrated solutions. We can use the power of nature in so many ways through the planning system, not just to protect the environment, but to achieve net environmental gain. We have been doing lots of work in the Environment Agency with colleagues to look at opportunities for natural flood management, for example, and we have some online advice around this actually for practitioners that you can find on gov.uk if you're thinking about setting up a natural flood management project and you're wanting to find out how you get funding and how you get advice. The blobs on the screen show you some of the benefits from a programme that we've been running. It's called the Natural Flood Management Programme for the last 6 years. It's literally just closed this year, and it was a 15 million pilots programme. And you can see some of the huge benefits that come from natural flood management, not just in terms of reducing flood risk, hence the flood being in the title, but actually delivering much, much broader benefits for communities in terms of habitats and biodiversity and water quality. And in urban areas, we're talking about sustainable urban drainage and green roofs and permeable paving. And there are so many levers that we can pull through the planning system to enable so much of this going forward. If I just go on to a final slide. So just as next steps, I too would like to really welcome the climate change guide. I know that one of the strong bits of feedback we get in the Environment Agency is that planners and developers are looking for really practical guidance. They want to know what to do to respond to a changing climate. They understand the rhetoric in some cases. They understand the narrative that's out there, some of the hairy, scary stats, but they actually just want some practical advice about what to do. And I think this guide serves them really well, actually, in doing that. And we'll be working with many colleagues, but I would particularly like to cite the TCPA in taking forward delivery of our FCRM strategy and ensuring that we continue to support planners and developers with the skills and capabilities that we know they need to be fit for the future in terms of resilience to flooding and coastal change. And some of that includes package of e-learning and other training that we'll be taking forward too. So I very much hope that will continue to provide the kind of practical support that planners and developers need around the country. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you very much. You can get off mute there. Thank you ever so much. And I really think your message around there are basics that can be improved is really important. Especially I think in light of some of the comments in the chat, we recognise it's a really challenging time, and perhaps we can pick some more of that up in the discussion as well. But last but by no means least, I would like to introduce our fourth response from the Right Honourable Nick Raynsford, who is our president, but also was a member of Parliament from 1992 to 2015. During that time, Nick held various ministerial and shadow minister roles, including a minister in the Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions, as it was back then, where he held responsibility for housing, planning and construction. So over to you, please, Nick.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and good afternoon, everyone. The three key messages I want to get across this afternoon are, firstly, the scale and nature of the climate change challenge poses an unprecedented and existential threat to the survival of our society in a form that is recognisable and sustainable. There's absolutely no point in trying to pretend that the problem won't materialise. It'll prove less serious than all the science tells us will be the case, or that solutions will magically appear in time to save us from the appalling consequences of further uncontrolled rises in global temperature. The well-documented experiences of the past few years, whether of catastrophic fires, for example, in Australia, in Russia or California, floods in Germany, China and Bangladesh, or the increasingly violent and frequent storms which have impacted the Caribbean, the southern states of the USA and India, as well as many other impacts, have demonstrated the massively destructive forces which are likely to ravage our planet if urgent action isn't taken to slow the relentless rise in temperatures. We have, I believe, passed in the last 2 years a significant tipping point in public opinion. The evidence is now so strong, so persuasive, that it cannot be ignored by any except the most deluded climate skeptics, of whom sadly there are still a few around. So this is a huge challenge, which must be tackled with every means available. And that takes me to my second point. History teaches us that when our country has in the past faced the most severe challenges, and I take, for example, the 2 world wars which ravaged most of Europe and much of the globe in the 20th century, we recognized just how vital planning was to ensure our survival. The nature of the challenge may have been different, but there was a clear understanding throughout the ranks of government and society that comprehensive professional planning was essential. Whether this was to ensure that we were producing enough food to nourish the population, whether it was that we were securing the materials necessary to meet our industrial needs, or the materials and the manufacturing processes required to ensure that we produce the necessary weapons, the ships, the equipment that our country needed to defend itself and ultimately to secure victory. Planning was absolutely vital to success. No one argued that it could be left to chance or that government intervention would have a negative consequence. Our whole society recognized that we were in a struggle for survival and we needed to plan meticulously across the length and breadth of the country and across the whole range of institutions and social structures to ensure that we could prevail. So today, facing a threat in many ways as terrifying, even if its nature is different, we need to recognize the vital role that planning will play in tackling and reversing the trend of climate change. Put very simply, we have to turn the tide. It won't happen without an enormous effort involving meticulous and very coordinated planning on the huge number of responses necessary to achieve that outcome. Which brings me to my third point. This is not something which can be left to others to resolve. All of us are involved. We are all in this together, not just here in the UK, but globally. And we need to work together relentlessly to make the necessary changes to safeguard the future of our planet. That is why international gatherings such as COP26 are so important. But equally, that's why what is done in every community in the UK is vital too. Good planning can ensure that we maximize the impact of the mitigation and adaptation measures we need to take, and that require an input from every neighbourhood, every local authority in the country. Other speakers have highlighted many of the key issues which must be addressed, and I won't repeat the examples. What I will, however, stress is that whether we're talking about large infrastructure projects or large-scale regeneration schemes, medium or smaller scale industrial or commercial developments, or residential developments of whatever scale, or if we're talking just about measures to enhance the resilience of small communities at risk of flooding, we need to be thinking at all times how best we can counter and reverse the consequences of climate change and take decisions that help towards that goal. Leadership is going to be vital, and I'm really delighted that RTPI and TCPA have come together to prepare and promote this new edition of the guide and to send out a loud and clear message that planning has a crucial role to play in this challenging context. I'm also delighted that we have the support of the Environment Agency and influential advocates such as Baroness Brown, and I'm delighted that we've had such a huge audience joining us this afternoon. This is a very difficult and hard challenge. The journey that Hugh told us we were getting underway won't be an easy one. There'll be all sorts of setbacks and disappointments along the way. But we have a fundamentally important task to achieve, and I hope that today's launch will help strengthen the commitment and determination we all have to ensure a successful outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Sorry, I was scrolling through the questions there, I got quite distracted. But thank you ever so much. Thank you to all of our respondents. I think really important points raised there, and we are really grateful for everybody's support for the guide. We've had lots of questions in. I think perhaps unsurprisingly, quite a few of them are specifically about the guide. So Hugh and Jessie, probably quite a few for you. But if other panel members would like to chip in, please do. I think we'll go with, probably one of the early ones first, and I'll combine two because we've got quite a few, so I might sort of compress a few. But Hugh, probably one for you to kick off. Somebody has kindly said this guidance is very welcome, but noted that it's guidance. And I know you touched on this in your contribution. So where are the teeth? And I think related to that as well, do local authorities actually have enough power to make this possible?
Okay, so to be quick, no, of course they don't, particularly in England. Let's all be open and honest that more power is needed at local level, and many of the comments in the chat reinforce that. This is a 4 nations and regions guide, so powers are different, but particularly on permitted development in England, which you all understand, that's been extremely unhelpful. What's more helpful is that everything written in this guide operates within the law and policy that's relevant on the ground. We're not asking people to do something that goes beyond that, even when we quite like to, but we're not. So the point about this is that it works within the existing powers broadly that exist. And it's designed in place, it's definitely to push the boundary, to pursue the logic. And I really advocate this line on carbon emissions, for example, and particularly the 6th carbon budget, that local authorities pursue the logic. And particularly on viability, Fiona, that does not trump your climate commitments. Any guidance in England on viability, written in guidance, is not as significant as the requirements you're placed under it, which the guide sets out. I'm happy to talk about that more, but it is incredibly boring, I know, viability, but very, very, very important. And there's one final quick thing about it, that hopefully this also gives you elbow room. No one, as Nick rightly said, is pretending this is easy. The obligations that you've got here are a real major factor in pushing back I would finally say the private sector has got to seize this. If you as a body and house builder don't have climate change as a core principle in your corporate strategy, you do not have a business model for the next 10 years. It's as simple as that. And the insurance industry demonstrates why that is.
Thanks, Hugh. And other panel members, if you would like to come in, do wave at me, but I will ask a few to, I think, Hugh and Jessie, just because people are asking about the contents of the guidance, if that's okay. So we also have a question. So I think, understandably, there's quite a lot in both the chat and in the Q&A about recognising existing homes and buildings and their obviously their lifespan, which we've touched on, looking longer term. So people asking about retrofit and what they can do about the current built environment purely, rather than just purely thinking about new development. So Hugh, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good set of questions, and it stems from the fact that the existing planning system has limited powers on retrofit. Again, I think we need to be honest about that. That requires, like the announcements made over the last sort of 30 hours, it requires government to play a much stronger role, particularly in terms of existing buildings and where that investment will come from. But there are measures, and I'm struck particularly in terms of what Wei said about the multiple benefits which action on climate change adaptation, for example, can bring on placemaking and town centre redevelopment. Now, of course, that requires investment streams to be there, but the planning system can create those kind of, it can create those master plans for new and existing places. And so, for example, in London, if we think about that as as just one small challenge, and the greening of London, that is all a retrofit problem, isn't it? And all of it requires an idea and a strategy and a vision behind it. And so the most important thing here is that visions are often seen as being, well, this is just talk, this is peripheral. You need to be able to take a community on a journey to an end point where you can see this remarkably positive outcome for them as a community. And that requires a very strong vision. And the majority of that might be adapting and changing buildings. Planning strategies are a powerful starting point on that.
And Baroness Brown, I know you mentioned the importance of vision in your contribution. I just wondered if you might want to say a little bit more about that as well.
I think vision is a vision of what a well-adapted community or a well-adapted country as such is the challenge we're giving the government. What that looks like is really crucial. And Julie, of course, I think very nicely talked about how the Environment Agency have really taken on that challenge in terms of the flood and coastal erosion management strategy. And I think, that there are some really exciting kind of visions we see coming up globally. I mean, I think one that I find very appealing, particularly in the context of surface water flooding, which Julie mentioned, and which we on the Adaptation Committee are continually stressing is still a really critical area for this Chinese vision of sponge cities designed with lots of places that can absorb water, with those sustainable urban drainage systems that Hugh mentioned, with that additional green space that we all need. We all found out we needed so much during COVID, but also acts to provide cooling, as Hugh flagged up, for the urban heat island effect, but also enables wildlife and biodiversity. So I think, for people to understand how beautiful a well-adapted environment could look like and how desirable this could be, is really helpful also in getting communities to engage and start talking about what do they want their environment to look like, as well as how do they want it to perform, what important services does it provide for them. So I think it may seem a bit frivolous to spend time doing the vision piece, but I think it's actually hugely important.
Thank you very much. I think a question for you, probably Wei. We've had a question saying there seems to be a shortage of planners at a time when planning is rightly coming to the fore. How do we fill this gap without diluting the quality of proposals and decisions? Yes,
I think a very important point, because it's I think the planning we are really under resource. We are really under resource at the moment. So actually, that's a issue has been widely recognized by all the professionals, and also I think if the ministry is very aware of that issue, and also we are really urgently need more future generations to join the planning profession, and then to diversify the planning profession. So the RTPI, we have started our apprenticeship scheme to have the 7th grade student to join at a postgraduate level. And then later on, we are open to undergraduate level. So we are encouraging the planning profession to be a much more representative profession of our community. And also, one point I want to say is really, we need to really embed innovation in our planning profession, because I think naturally the government think climate change, the key sector to tackle the climate change are engineering sector, and also scientists, they are the key sector. But I mentioned many times, planning profession is applied science. We relate to actually applied environmental, social, and the behavioral science. So actually, how we can apply these methodologies and the technologies into our real society making and the place making is very important. So we really combine the plan making and the place making together. I think that's some fact. We need to really make that point very clear. We are the profession to make things happen into a real place. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've got quite a few quite specific questions around different scenarios, and I think some examples where local authorities have got a slightly out of date local plan with no relevant policies, and others that have declared a climate emergency and are just desperate for advice. So I will put a couple of those to you, probably Hugh, but others, again, wave at me if you'd like to come in. So and hopefully that will help. I think if some of our audience aren't brave enough to admit what position they're currently in, or whether their local authority is taking action or not. But we've got someone who is a district councillor, and they played a part in getting the council to declare a climate emergency back in summer 2019. And they had a very ambitious target of net zero by 2030. But since then, there's been very little action, despite repeated attempts by the person asking the question to at least begin an SPD on climate change, and that's been ignored, with both officers and members saying it's not necessarily because the MPPF or national policy will cover it. So as they haven't quite asked the question, but they have said help. So Hugh, first steps, what can this person do?
So the first thing to say is I can see a lot of people in the chat who've had a bruising 20-year career trying to make the climate action happen. And I want to urge us all, including me, who's a bit cynical about it as well, to kind of do a reset at COP26. Let's just all start again and pretend that we now have the political backing we always longed for. And I think things have changed. So the first thing to say is the context is very different, as I said, even in 6 months. So I think a lot of local battles in my own patch reflect debates that happened, before the kind of current rise of the change in politics. But I do think that there is a massive swathe of local government who are finding exactly that problem. What do we do? And the guide sets out what you can do. But supplementary planning documents are being used widely in order to include climate objectives. You need a hook for that in your local plan, obviously, to start off with. And partial reviews of local plans can be instituted. In fact, actually, there's a multiple set of things that you can do: partial reviews, SPDs, and of course the fact that we're moving into a major period of planning reform in England, where apparently all local plans will be remade quite rapidly if we get a planning bill, is the biggest opportunity to enshrine climate change in the local planning process that's ever existed in this country. So that's upcoming. But the challenges are the ones that Wei has identified. The real barriers are the use of viability as a block, issues around skills and resources, so that it's very difficult to actually make action happen. And my top advice about that is just look around at the other good practice that Jessie was talking about in her presentation. There's some inspirational things, but the gap between the very best local authority in England, where I'm sitting, and well, let me not describe it as the very worst, but the ones who are hanging back is enormous. So if Cornwall can do what it can do, anyone can do that. That's not political. That's not a legal constraint or a policy constraint. And the MPPF is really key, and this is really important. That there is that duty. Local plans must have policy on mitigation adaptation. That is the most powerful legal outcome duty in any part of planning law. Absolutely critical. Section 19, 2004 Act says you must have policy on mitigation. When you read the MPPF, It says that must be in line. Admittedly, it's in a footnote, which is a bit peculiar, but footnotes have same legal status as the main content. That must be in line with the Climate Act. So your local plan must be in line with the carbon budgets which are set out under the Climate Act. And that is a very powerful legal obligation. And if people are not fulfilling that obligation, then they have to be able to demonstrate why. Much more powerful than any viability guidance anyone provides. So if people don't want to do climate actions in local planning and they're pushing back and making objections, say that's fine, got to hit the target. So if we don't do this, what else do we do? That's the question constantly to ask.
And I think probably the reality is we have quite a lot of out-of-date local plans. And I know we've sort of touched on this, but I want to ask it again because I think it's a really important question that people keep asking, I know us. But basically we've got somebody who is operating in a local authority who would like to be more ambitious in seeking new developments, equality and new developments to tackle climate change, but they are faced with an out-of-date or weak local plan, and they know that they haven't seen many housing schemes dismissed due to the impact of climate change. So again, what can they do other than hopefully get on and update their local plan to actually, pick up the points you've mentioned? Are there other tools available?
I would just say quickly, I think that is the nightmare scenario, and it pushes you into development management. And it does a bit depend, because I can't see, I'm sorry, Fiona, what nation that comment is from.
I think it's England, because they mentioned the NPPA.
Right, so it's in different guidance, but I think we do try to say in development management decisions, where the issue of climate change, I think, is being very variably applied. Well, that needs to change. The issue is very clear. Carbon and the Climate Change Act are powerful material considerations in development management. In what universe would they not be? And they need to be fully accounted for. It depends on the proportionality of what's being proposed in any development management decision. And so that contribution is there. Now, it's true that it's much better to start full-scale review of policy in a local plan to embed climate change and try and manage it from the back end through development management if you've not got the right policy. But let's be absolutely clear that that's there and there is precedent for that. So that's the question that we need to be asking of decisions. And in that context, the general rule of thumb on development management is that every decision counts that you make. Every decision counts. So how have you reflected climate change in all of those issues?
Thanks, Hugh. I'll come to you, Wei, in just a second. And Julie, I might bring you in if that's okay. I just wanted to actually highlight and then I'll come to you, Baroness Brown. Just on this, I think it's worth highlighting paragraph 48 of our new net zero strategy, which was published, I think, at approximately 1 o'clock today. As others have said, we've sort of obviously been skimming it, but it's absolutely not a full analysis. But it's worth noting, certainly if you're an English local authority, that the new net zero strategy points to the National Model Design Code and states, the text states that the National Model Design Code provides tools and guidance for local planning authorities to help ensure developments respond to the impacts of climate change, are energy efficient, embed circular economy principles and reduce carbon emissions. Now, the fact that that's been restated in the net zero strategy, I think is interesting. And also, DLUC have been clear that if you don't have a local design guide, then the national model design guide policy should be relevant for your area. So again, I think there are increasingly tools available, although we recognise absolutely, as many people are saying, we do want more government action. We want an updated national planning policy framework. We want more funding, etc., etc. But there are hooks, I think, increasingly available to hopefully give local authorities some more teeth in pushing back at poor quality applications. So Wei, if I come to you, and then Julie, and then Baroness Brown, if that's okay.
Thank you, Fiona. I want to follow up from Hugh's point. I think it's very important for us to align our local plan with our corporate strategy of the whole council. It's very important to make sure actually it's the same strategy rather than being them separate. Because sometimes we take development control as a separate function, but actually it's a very much part of delivering the overall corporate strategy. I think a good example is from Plymouth. They have aligned all their actions together to make sure whatever is being delivered is aligned to that strategy. And also another good example is from Cornwall. They produced a decision-making wheel. So actually that's being what originally proposed by a planning officer actually has been adopted by the whole council. So whatever action is being taken by the council, everybody's checking that will to make sure it's aligned to the sustainability targets. I think that's a very good way to join the forces together within the council.
Thank you, Wei. And actually, we use that example of the decision-making wheel in a report that we did with the Association of, APSI earlier this year. So we'll try and put a link in the chat and people might be able to have a look at that. Julie, I just wondered if you had thoughts around tools available. I know you mentioned that people are granted against the Environment Agency's advice at times, which seems like one option.
Well, as you might expect me to say, please take the Environment Agency's advice.
Well, that would be a start.
Seems like a straightforward thing to say, but actually we are there to help. We are the statutory planning advisor on flood and water matters. So yes, we are there to help, actually, just genuinely. I actually just want to pick up on a couple of things, just listening to the conversation. So SUDS, I think these are all just helpful tips, actually picking up on some things people have said. So on SUDS, London, through Westminster Council and the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, has done a brilliant SUDS pilot. So it's a great example of, obviously, a really congested area that is retrofitting different natural flood management techniques. It's actually quite award-winning, so I would encourage everybody to go and take a look at that. That's a good best practice tool. If you're worrying about having an out-of-date local plan, recognising that they may all be about to be updated very quickly according to planning reforms coming along. But if you're currently sitting on an outdated local plan, well, an individual planning application still can use our climate change allowances. That's the whole point of them. So those climate change allowances were updated in the summer to reflect the latest best guidance out there, updated for river flows and for sea level rise. So you should be using those to inform your decision making, and obviously constructively challenging where it presents issues locally. So maybe that might help. The other thing I would just cite is the importance of innovation. So we've got a flood and coastal resilience innovation programme going on at the moment, where the projects are being led by local authorities. So the Environment Agency's supporting it, but it's local authority led. And it's jointly with DEFRA, and that's doing just that, actually. It's testing ways to look at innovative approaches to flood and water management in localities, and it's looking at some of the harder areas. So things like surface water and groundwater flooding, where some of the solutions can be a lot more complicated and much more difficult and involve a really wide range of partners, including the water companies, for example. So those projects provide you with some information and some tools that will be helping colleagues with in coming years as well.
Thank you very much, Julie. And Baroness Brown, I know you wanted to come in.
Yes, I'm a particular hobby horse here, actually, but it follows on well from what Julie has said. And if local plans are being updated, then if you're around the coast in England, can you ensure that your local plan actually refers to the shoreline management plan? When we looked as the Adaptation Committee at the shoreline management plans for around the coast of England, we found that around 50% of the local plans didn't mention the shoreline management plan, and that's just crucial in terms of planning for changing sea level rise and wave heights and erosion and things. And as an equivalent one, we have the Thames Estuary 2100 plan, as I've mentioned before. And so if you're a borough on which has the Thames running through it, then again, please make sure your plans incorporate the Thames 2100 plan. And Julie may want to say a bit more than that, because she owns the Thames Estuary 2100 plan.
I think, just very quickly, because I think Julie is doing an amazing job already explaining the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. Again, you can get lots of information on gov.uk about that, actually, if you, again, want to see what best practice is. Could I just really underline the point about shoreline management plans? Because I should have mentioned that myself, and many of my colleagues in the EA will be saying, this is so important. We've got a really strong planning policy framework there for shoreline management plans to be considered. Coastal change management areas are well articulated in the current MPPF. We already have mechanisms for having really good debate and sometimes difficult choice conversations around shoreline management and coastal transition. So, so that is very much there. So, yeah, the importance of using shoreline management plans, really, really vital. And they are adaptive plans. They look out over the next 100 years. So they are exactly the kind of type of planning framework that we need. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you both. That's really helpful. Jessie, we've had a question just asking for some concrete examples of some of the best practice or the specific examples that are in the guide. So if somebody has come today and just wants to hear exactly what they should be putting in an updated local plan, can we give them some specific examples? I'm sure afterwards they will go away and read the whole guide, but just a couple of examples just to give a flavour.
Yeah, of course. So, well, the guide has got good practice examples throughout it. In every section, there is at least one sort of model local plan policy in there. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but there are a massive range. I know we've mentioned Cornwall already before. There's some from Cambridge on overheating. I know that they're doing a lot around that there. So if you're interested in that, go and check that out. Some things from Yorkshire on SUDs. Yeah, there's loads there. I can't remember them all, and I won't be able to go through them all now. But if you look in the contents page and look at what topic you want a good practice for, there should be one there. And if there's not, we can add one in at some point.
Thank you. We've had quite a specific question, and I think this is probably, which I've now just lost, sorry. Oh yes, which possibly for Jessie or Hugh. When the previous version of the guide was launched, the Climate Just web tool was promoted, and somebody has asked whether this is still available and up to date.
I can talk about that. Yeah, it is still available. It was last updated in 2018, and I'm not sure there's plans to update it again. To be honest, they haven't got any funding to do that, but it is still very relevant and useful. It's one of the only tools where you can see where they project future floodplains to be. So it's really, really useful, and you can overlay different levels of sort of socioeconomic data and flood risk, and talk about that climate justice angle that Nick was talking about earlier. So yeah, definitely still recommend looking at it.
Thank you very much. I guess again, drawing on that quite, the questions around specific policies that people should or perhaps shouldn't be including in their plans. Somebody has said, should all homes be built to passive house standard and be able to adapt to flooding and increasing heat waves? Hugh, is that a policy we are advocating?
I'm going to stick with being really straightforward about this. If I was running a local plan, yeah, that's what I'd be doing. I mean, the passive house is a assessment framework. In my ignorance, you have to learn about there's a lot of complexity. So you could pick what BRE and their communities program is doing as well. There are different assessment frameworks, but it's interesting to see the number of local authorities who are doing that, trying to push the boundary. But the most important thing I think that comes out of that is to pick the language of your local plan. So the language in the last 15 years has been very provisional. So local plans do reference around the country passive house, but they'll sort of often say, well, we'd quite like to build some passive house houses if that's awfully all right with you as developers, and perhaps you could abide by this 1 week every 2 months. Language around climate change has to be directive and precise in local plans. You must is the language. And that is very important on viability, because that allows the market land price to adjust. If you're not clear with the development sector what you're requiring, then they can't adjust their land deals to reflect that. And without that right pricing of land, you get caught in viability arguments. It's really critical that whatever you're expressing is credible, evidence-based, benchmarked against something like passive house framework, and clearly expressed from the beginning of the plan process.
Thank you. And another one for Hugh, and then perhaps Baroness Brown. Oh, Baroness Brown, would you like to respond to that one? And then I'll ask it. Yeah.
Yes, from a climate change committee, adaptation committee perspective, support what Hugh says. I mean, new homes must be zero carbon, but they must have good ventilation. Insulation and ventilation need to go together hand in glove. They must be able to, they must have suitable shading and ability to cope with future temperatures, and they must have higher water efficiency standards than we have in the moment, particularly in water stressed areas where we need to be looking at water efficiency standards better than 100, I remember the units, 100 litres of water per person per day. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessie?
I was just going to add, of course, we advocate in the guide never to build in areas that are at risk of flooding, but surface water flooding is so difficult to predict that that's not always possible. So when you're talking about resilience standards for houses, there is something to be said for building flood resilient homes that can recover from that, even in areas that are not on flood risk maps.
Thank you, Jessie. I think related to that, but also that you know, the wider points that people are making around the fact that, of course, our existing housing stock is something that we need to think about just as much, well, if not more than new development. Somebody has asked, what advice would the panel have on existing urban areas that have already been built in high flood risk areas? Should the focus continue to be on flood defence, or should we be thinking about removing sensitive uses from those areas altogether? Perhaps Hugh, you could kick us off, and then happy to bring in others.
I'll be quick because this is so sensitive, I think, and certainly 2 to 3 years ago, people didn't want to talk about relocation. Of course, it depends what the impact and the vulnerabilities are, and of course, you know, flood defence and natural flood defence may well be solutions in the short and medium term. But the missing part of the psychological jigsaw in this country is long-term strategic relocation thought process. Now, the committee is thinking about it, and you and Julie, the agency, is thinking about it. It's not that it's not there, but in local planning authorities, it's not being reflected. So I can say this, probably maybe others can't. There are some parts of the East Coast that are going to have to be relocated. That's just a reality. And what's terrifying is we haven't started the thought process about that. That's either because the flood defence isn't feasible, or ultimately isn't cost effective, or just because there isn't a physical solution may not be available to them. So for those authorities, if you just think that through very quickly, if those authorities need to think strategically, and therefore we need to think regionally, which is Nick Raynsford's point about where those people are going to live, relocation has to be part of the suite of solutions, doesn't it? It is a last resort, but it does need to be carefully thought about. Now, there is a model policy, Jessie, I think, from a Devon district, and excuse my lack of brain power here, which actually, some local authorities are beginning to do that on a small scale, beginning to see a pathway for people whose homes are going to have to move. We also need a compensation regime to go with that, and I'm not aware that we have that yet, and that's absolutely critical.
Thank you. Julie, and then Julia, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just build on Hugh's point. So there's the coast and then there's inland. So the question was probably asking about both, I'm guessing. Everything that Hugh said is really fair, and I agree with. I think that's where, just with, again, what can you do right now to help you with planning and adapting for coastal transition? That is where your shoreline management plans really help. You know, they set out policies and risk out for decades to come. So they help to provide that long tool for planning, really importantly for engaging communities in really thinking about that, because these are long-term issues in many cases, even for some of our most highest eroding risk coastlines. You need a phenomenal amount of really good community engagement and involvement to really understand and own those risks. Inland, when talking about areas already, properties, homes already in high flood risk areas, we should be thinking about the Build Back Better options. So that's a property flood resilience, for example. Some of the things that we know, Flood Re, for instance, will provide, are increasingly able to provide insurance discounts on, in order to help people living already in areas at risk of flooding, which they are only going to have an increased risk of flooding, I'm afraid, due to living with climate change. So property flood resilience measures are a good thing. They're things that we should be thinking about increasingly for homes and businesses in areas at risk of flooding as well.
Thank you.
And can I just add from a fairness and justice perspective, as areas become increasingly prone to flood risk, we need to be watching out for, as the values of those properties drop, we need to be looking out that those don't just become areas where we see concentrations of disadvantaged people, elderly people, poor people, uninsured homes those people who are less able to be less resilient to the changing climate, and where the impacts of flooding will actually disproportionately disadvantage them, because that's the danger of areas like this, that, as Hugh says, if we don't make positive decisions about what we're going to do about them, that they turn into some kind of area of slum or disadvantage, which is exactly what we don't want to see.
Thank you. I am conscious we've got about 7 minutes to go, and I must allow 1 minute to wrap up. So I'm going to pose a final question to the panel, and I'm keen to allow all of you a sensible amount of time to respond to it. So I think people have rightly, I think, welcomed the guide. Absolutely, we think it's incredibly important. And as I mentioned in my introductory comments, we're really keen that people don't sit back and wait for the government in the developed nations as well to take action. There are hooks to enable local authorities to get on and do some of this right now. But there's also recognition in some of the questions that, while planning is absolutely vital, it can't do everything on its own. And so there is obviously trying to influence at the national and international level as well. So a few people actually have said, if you could identify one or perhaps two things that the government should do today to help local or planning authorities, or more generally tackle the climate emergency, what would those asks be? So I will put you on the spot first, Hugh, I think, and then perhaps Wei, Julie, and Baroness Brown, and Jessie, if you have a different one from Hugh, do feel free to come in as well. Hugh, what would
it be? Okay, if it was my birthday, I would say, an immediate ministerial statement putting climate change centrally as the first amongst equals of planning considerations. And all I would say is we're going to watch that planning bill in England very hard. There are policy processes happening in all nations and regions which need to be watched hard, but front and centre in all policy and law for climate change, and then getting the delivery right. But actually, my final wish list is a different one entirely. It's not about government. Don't give up. To everyone on this call, everyone in the sector, everyone working in planning, I dare you to give up, because it's just too important, isn't it? So despite all the difficulties, we've just got to go on asking the right questions, pushing really hard.
Thank you, Hugh. Wei?
Thank you, Fiona. My question is very similar to Hugh's. Well, no, my answer is quite similar to Hugh's. I think, first of all, the government need to give more mandatory requirement. I joined a similar discussion about green infrastructure. I think the answer was the same, because we have to make lots of requirement mandatory. We cannot ask local authorities to make this decision, because it will be very difficult, especially for local authorities located in rural areas or relatively less economic advanced boroughs. I think we have to make sure actually we could have that minimum standard. That has to be a legally binded requirement. And also, secondly, I think very much agree with Hugh. I think as a profession, we are highly creative. So I think we should be at the forefront to find innovative solutions and working with everybody in the society to push forward the agenda, not only about the climate agenda, also other about social inequality agenda, and also about how we can build beautiful homes for our future generations. So it's like a systems approach, as I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Judy?
Oh, it's really tough to, okay, so just we could have about 10. Okay, so building on the conversations, I think some clearer planning policy on coastal transition and adaptation is right up there, and join up across DEFRA and MHCLG on that. Secondly, we have a missing statutory consultee for surface water. There is no statutory consultee for surface water. That is a bizarre and strange gap. Why, when that is a huge growing risk? So I'd really like that one to be addressed in terms of policy. And just finally, I'd really like to pick up on the points I think Wei has really articulately made already about planning resources. I think that's for local authorities and statutory consultees, actually everybody who are professional planners. It needs to be much greater investment in the opportunities that planners can make for achieving much greater, brilliant places, brilliant and beautiful places. And I think that's somewhat undervalued at the moment in society at the moment. So yes, even in tough choices with the difficult spending review, I think investment in planners for the future would be up there as the third one to creep that in.
Thank you. And Julie, we've had a couple of people asking for links, I think, to some of the things you mentioned. So I don't know if you're able to quickly put those in, if that's possible.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And Baroness Brown, what would your big ask be?
My big ask would be to say so many of the tools to both mitigation and adaptation effectively and with the public engaged and part of it are in the hands of local authorities. And yet, you know, we're one of the country in Europe, I think, which holds most power and most funding centrally in Westminster. So certainly for England, it would be greater devolution of power to local authorities and the funding that they need to take action.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Jessie, did you want to, or Nick, if you're still there, if you want to flag any, please do. Nick?
Yes, if I may. Sorry if you thought I'd gone.
Sorry.
I was following the instructions to switch off when I wasn't speaking. But I just would reiterate my earlier message. Stop talking about planning as if it was a problem and think about it as absolutely vital to finding the solution, as we did when we faced major threats to our survival 70 years or so ago. You've got to plan, and you've got to plan in an integrated way. You've got to give people locally the confidence to do so, and that means they've got to have the resource to do so, and they've got to feel free from constantly being seen as a problem. So it's a change in the mindset of recognizing the huge importance of planning to help us find a way through what is going to be a massive challenge. And I just echo Hugh's comment, don't anyone give up. We've all got to do everything we can to try and get us through what is going to be a very hard journey.
Thank you. Jessie, did you want to come in? No, okay.
So I just wanted to say, I agree with everyone. And also we can send around those links from the Environment Agency as well. So sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Jessie. And yeah, as everyone said, we recognise that local authorities are, could do so much more with more power and more resource. But I hope people will read the guide that we've published today, hopefully be inspired by both the discussion today and the guidance, and recognise that we know the planning system could do so much more and be more powerful, but even in its current guise, there are hooks in there to enable people to plan and to take action. So please do. I must finally thank all of our panel and our speakers. Thank you so much. And all of our audience who have contributed. It's been really fascinating chat, and I'm so sorry I couldn't pick all of it up in the discussion. I must thank the RTPI for working with us on the guide. We really, it's been fantastic, and it's ended up as a fantastic resource. And Jessie will be sending links, information around. We will be running more training sessions specifically on the guidance, so please keep an eye out for those. I must also thank Flood-Re, Land Use Consultants and Green Blue Urban for sponsoring the guide. And if you would like to endorse the guidance, again, Jessie will send more information about that. Finally, if you've enjoyed today, please do keep an eye out for future TCPA events. The information is on our website. We have Lord Deben speaking as the keynote at our annual conference in November, and we would be delighted if some of you would come along to that in November. So thank you very much, and we will certainly be in touch with all of the resources we've talked about and future opportunities to hear more about the guidance and planning for climate change. Thank you.